we're very fortunate to have Maneesh Sahani here. Maneesh Sahani is currently a professor of theoretical neuroscience and machine learning at the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit at the University College London. Maneesh did his bachelor and PhD from Caltech, and he mostly worked on the interface of the fields of machine learning and neuroscience, with particular emphasis on the types of computations achieved with the sensory and motor cortical system. So today I think we're going to hear about the probabilistic of the perceptual system. So I don't know, would you like to be interrupted or?
Yes, absolutely. Do please ask questions. I will echo what Rava and everyone else has said. This will work much, much better if we just have a conversation rather than my standing up here and just talking for an hour and a half.
And Beijing side, if you can't hear very well, then maybe just let me know, and then I kind of like tell Maneesh to
okay, yep.
closer to the mic. But yeah, so we should have a good session, and then I'll just kind of keep the time, but most of the time.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Yes, hopefully the sound will be okay, but do let me know. I've developed a rather loud lecturing voice, so maybe this will work. So thank you, Rava and Jaging and everybody for the invitation to come. I think this will be fun. I'm looking forward to it. I will be around for much of the week, so please, students, do just come and have a chat, talk about things if you'd like to. That's the point of the schools like this, is to have a conversation. All right. Having said that, I'm going to break the mold a little bit. Rather than doing this first talk as being entirely basic and the second talk as being entirely advanced, they're both going to be slightly mixed together. Most of this first talk will be quite basic, so it will fit. It's going to be a bit of a historical perspective on various aspects of inference in perception. But then I'll touch on or just give you some hints for things that are going on right now, maybe not in so much depth in today's lecture. And then I think on Friday is when I'll give my second lecture. And at that point, we'll switch gears a little bit to thinking about the neural mechanisms that might underlie, or hypotheses about neural mechanisms that could underlie the kinds of computation you need to do inference through perception. And that will, I think, push on to some somewhat more advanced ideas, hopefully, if we have time. Okay, so what do we mean, to start off with, by inference in perception? So here's a problem of perception. You're enjoying the fruits of your foraging in a sort of turn of the last century primeval forest, and you suddenly spy another orange thing in the undergrowth. Okay, and now you have to make a decision, and actually you're going to hear about the decision-making part of this, which is not what I'm going to talk about later in the course as well. But your decision is between, what is that orange thing? It might be another piece of fruit, which you might like to pick up and stash away for later consumption. But these particular forests are known to harbor exotic beasts, and so it might be one of those, in which case you're better off running away. Okay, so how do you make these sorts of decisions? These are this kind of decision is something that we need to make at some level all the time, right? It might be about picking something up or not. It might be about where to put your foot next as you're trying to run downhill, off a steep mountain, as some might be doing around here. And there are many cues that we need to put together to make these sorts of decisions, right? Some of them will be image-based, and there are many image-based cues. We might be, looking at the texture of this orange thing. The color, in fact, is a cue to start with. We might pay attention to any motion, either of the masking undergrowth in front of it. Actually, pointing there doesn't help those in Beijing. The masking undergrowth around there, or we might be looking for motion of the object itself. We can also combine information by listening out for sounds. In this case, we might be interested in the odors that might be around here. There's also all sorts of contextual information that may influence our decision. We might know whether or not this orange object is under an orange tree. right? Which is sort of a contextual prior for it likely being a piece of fruit. We might know whether this is the time of year or the part of the forest where the beasts are likely to be, right? And again, that might influence the sorts of decisions that we make. But interestingly, also affect the way we perceive these sorts of things. This kind of information, there's lots of evidence, gets fed back into what we might think of as perceptual systems. And even costs. The fact that missing out on a piece of fruit, if I already have plenty, might be much different to going and disturbing a tiger, if it is one. That asymmetry in costs can also, it turns out, play a role in actually what perception we make about the quantity. Okay, so the point that we're going to sort of dwell on in my lectures at least, but actually I think you're going to hear about this from many of the other lecturers as well. So there's a nice thematic structure to many of these from what I can tell, is that these sorts of cues end up being integrated effectively, very close to optimally in many situations, and very flexibly. Right, we can have some of them present and not others. We can combine them in different ways depending on context. And all of this gets put together in order to create the sorts of percepts we have. And the question, sort of the deep underlying question that many of us are after is, how do brains manage to do something like that so effectively? Okay, one way that people have looked at this or thought about it over time has been to look for sort of signatures, signals of this kind of inferential perception. So hopefully what I mean by inference is getting a little bit clearer. It's this idea of working out a quantity that is a physical property of the world. In this case, what is that orange thing? Or in the case that I'm showing you here, sorry, pointing the wrong way again. Which of these two bars in this image might be the longer? From the sensory information and other contextual information that we have available. That's the inferential problem. These sorts of, we call them visual illusions, that's probably a bit of a misnomer, these sort of diagnostic figures help us work out some of these structural assumptions that go into this process. And this is one that Richard Gregory, one of the pioneers of thinking about the visual system in this particular way, was very fond of. It's a very simple illusion, if you like. Most people will perceive the upper of these two horizontal bars on the left-hand side as being slightly longer. One explanation for that is that these two slanted lines, one interpretation of them is that they're parallel lines going off into the distance, as railway tracks might be. And so since this one comes closer to those parallel lines and this one's further apart from those parallel lines, you interpret the one that's further away as being closer, as being longer, sorry. A really excellent illustration of this sort of inferential process in perception, I think, comes from this illustration put together by Ted Adelson at MIT. It's really quite beautiful. This is, most people, if you look at these two squares labeled A and B, will think that A is in some sense darker. If the question was about the number of photons or the sort of luminance on the screen approaching your eye, that would be the wrong answer. Actually, they're exactly the same luminance, as hopefully these two sidebars helps you see. But there's a very robust sense that A is in fact darker than B. Okay, so I think these sorts of probes of perception, and I'm going to come on to some more quantitative measurements in a moment, give us a sense for many of the challenges that we have for thinking about what's going on in these kinds of perceptual systems. So one point is that perception is flexible, right? So there's a tendency that I'm going to sort of try to argue against as we go through that's come from machine learning in the last little while, to think that perception's a solved problem because I can take some big feed-forward network, train it on lots of images, and it will do object categorization for me, okay? And that's a caricature, of course. I don't think anyone in the machine learning field actually believes that that's the solution to the problem. But that caricature is one that I think has, in some ways, become a current idea, and it's sort of setting the zeitgeist in some sense. And I think that that's the wrong view. and we'll talk about why. So one reason why is that our ability to interrogate these scenes is incredibly flexible, right? I don't just recognize the object seen on the right-hand side as having a checkerboard and a green cylinder and maybe a light source somewhere or the other. I can go in and ask questions perceptually about the luminance of different elements of it, the gradation of shading across the cylinder, right? All of these things are accessible perceptually, right? So there's really a parsing of the scene into lots of different components, all where your percept of each one of them is being influenced by all the other things that are around it, right? And that's sort of the second point, is that what that perceptual process seems to be doing is making inferences about some sort of physical property, in this case about the actual length of objects in the three-dimensional world, in this case about the reflectance, the paint reflectance on the surface of this checkerboard, which, given all the cues available here, is likely to be darker for A than for B, rather than a question about the actual 2D image that is being projected onto your retina, where these two bars are of equal length and where the number of photons coming from A or the photon density from A and the photon density from B are equal. So there's a disconnect between properties of the two-dimensional image, which are not what we see, and properties of the world that might have created that two-dimensional image, which is what perception seems to be inferring. And then, the other point, echoing what I said about looking at the orange, is that this process of inference is combining all sorts of different sources of information, right? There's local cues, there are global cues. These, in this case, there's the slant over here. The local luminance is one of the cues that comes in, but it's not the only one. Otherwise, there'd be of equal darkness. We're also looking at properties of surround in the checkerboard, the regularity of that global pattern of the checkerboard, the shadow and inferred locations of light, and all these sorts of things. All of this gets put together into a single, very robust percept. Okay. And then another point that I think is important, again, often when I'm talking to audiences sort of coming from a more machine learning background, is that they're thinking, there's this problem of out-of-domain generalization in machine learning. You can do very well with new examples of images that are pretty much the same as your training data, but look at something entirely different, and it can be very difficult to achieve the same sort of tasks. And indeed, giving labels to the objects in this particular image might be very difficult, unless you happen to be a fan of sort of mid or latter part of the last century French animation. But nonetheless, you can parse the image, right? There's no problem with working out what's in front of what's what the relative sizes of things are, making inferences about maybe whether things are organic or not. All of these things are possible, even though we're looking at something that might be entirely unfamiliar. Okay, so these are the sorts of very high-level observations that we might make about perception that we're going to sort of bring into trying to dial down into the system and think about how brains might be able to do this. And one of the key ideas that we're going to focus on at various points is representation. Okay, so we're going to talk about learning representation mostly today, and this idea of representational learning is one that has been sort of taken up a lot of enterprise in people thinking both from a machine point of view and a cognitive point of view about systems. And then on Friday, I'm going to talk about representations of quantities with their associated uncertainties, because we'll see that probabilities and uncertainties are very important to inference. But in fact, although it's often easy to think about sort of representations as their own goals and define cost functions on representations directly, such as efficient coding or redundancy reduction and things like this, the selective pressure on the system isn't really representational, it's computational, right? So the goal of a representation has to be one that helps achieve the computation. And the computation is basically the stuff that you need to do to survive, right? And that effectively means choosing a good action in the current context, whatever it might be. That's what we need to do to survive. So perception is only useful to the extent that it allows you to choose those actions well. It's also important, I think, to note this comment about range of timescales, right? So part of this contextual idea that I laid out is that some of that information needs to be integrated over much longer timescales. Some of it's instantaneous. It's just processing the visual world or the auditory world or sensory world in general as we see it. Okay, so that issue of timescale kind of comes into this next point, which is that in principle, we can think about this sort of process of learning good input to action transformations as really just a big function approximation problem, right? There is, for every situation, given sensory input, there's the right thing to do. And if I get enough examples of the right thing to do, or I get to explore the world enough and get reinforcement that tells me whether I've done well or not in different contexts, I might be able to learn that big functional transformation. And this is basically what, the underlying idea behind, a lot of success in the machine learning world in the last little while at aping things that we might think of as cognitive processing. So a deep learning, reinforcement learning system is basically doing just that. The sorts of things you see come from DeepMind and playing Go and StarCraft and various other things are, broadly speaking, learning these function approximators. They're working out what's a good mapping from the current sensory environment to an output with an awful lot of training data. And from a sort of psychological tradition, again, with a caricature that is unfair to Skinner, but I'm going to make it, we might class this as a kind of behaviorism, Skinnerian behaviorism. But the problem with this sort of view is that, again, this problem of out-of-domain generalization, in effect. Right? The flexibility is somewhat limited in terms of being able to work in environments that we have not had experience of and generalizing over to them, unless we can learn from the data that we do have something about the actual causal interactions of objects in the world. In which case those causal interactions, the underlying structure, will port over into new environments reasonably well. Okay, so flexibility is limited, and in practice, that the kind of data you need to train a deep learning system is enormous and much beyond that available to animals, and indeed, in many cases, the information, a lot of the mappings that animals need to make are actually developmentally programmed. They're things that animals can do basically at birth. And we also, actually, another point on the slide there, which is worth emphasizing, is that we also know that purely passive exposure to different sensory environments changes structures in the brain. Right? There's this whole series of experiments showing that. So a lot of the learning that I'm going to focus on today is going to be what in a machine learning context we would call unsupervised. All you have is the sensory environment, and your job is to try to make sense of it. Okay, so the alternative in sort of the psychological, sort of this dualism, or not dualism, the kind of dual streams of thought in psychology in much of the last century would be called cognitivism. And this was the idea that there are these sort of structured internal representations that can be carried over time and that really reflect properties of the world in some sense. And this notion is also has been supported by the fact that as we go into brains and we look for representations of things that we might think of as inferred properties, things like the movement of things in the world, object identities and things like this, we find evidence for them. Okay, so there's some evidence for neural representations. Obviously, part of that's guided by the fact that that's what we went looking for when we looked in brains. But nonetheless, once we find them, they do seem to be there, robust, reproducible across individuals, across species in many cases. What do we mean by representation in this context, right? So it means that the activity in a part of the brain will vary in a systematic way with some quantity that we might be making an inference about, that as an experimenter we can set in the outside world, right? So there needs to be selectivity to some number of dimensions of the outside world for this to be a representation. But it should only be that subset that matters, right? If I have a representation of a particular quantity of the luminance of one of those squares in Ted Adelson's picture, then that estimate of reflectance rather, should be invariant to things like the overall illumination color of the environment, right? Which our percepts are generally invariant to. So we need both this property of selectivity and invariance in a representation. And that's an idea that we'll come back to when we talk in greater detail about representations, particularly of uncertainty, on Friday. But I think is an important one to keep in mind as you think about people talking about representations in neuroscience, is that this duality of selectivity and variance is really what we're looking for and what we use to define a representation. And so we do find many of these, right? We find them for orientation in the early visual cortex. We find them for types of objects, for phonemes in human auditory cortex, where phonemes are important quantities for language, for words, of course. And people have claimed evidence for things like concepts at a much higher level, affordances, the ways in which you can interact with different pieces of the world, choices of actions. All of these things seem to have representations in the sense of selectivity and invariance that I've just tried to describe.
Can maybe just ask, how constraining is this idea? So if I have a system, like if the brain is coupled with the outside world through the sensory receptors, so there will be some activity that will be correlated to the outside world. So that's the first thing you need. And then you need to be extract from that activity something that is invariant, right? So you need the correlation and the invariance with respect to other parameters.
That's right. Right. So you need selectivity. So that's what I mean. So the correlation would be selectivity. That is, you are selective to a particular property. So as the luminance of that, or as the reflectance of that square changes, or your inference about the reflectance of the square changes, the activity of a representation should change if it is indeed a representation of reflectance in that sense. But as other properties, in that case, the overall illuminance or maybe the arrangement of objects in the scene, as those things change, then but your inference stays constant. Rather, by definition, if the representation is one of that inference, it will stay the same. So that's the idea, is that if we can map neuronal activity to the outcomes of these inferences, this is the property we should have. We do need to be a little careful though, right? Because in an experiment, we will often think about the invariance and selectivity as being invariance and selectivity to the actual physical quantity that I can determine as an experimenter. And we need to leave open the very real possibility that the inference that the observer makes based on the physical properties is actually different in those different situations, and that some of the variability that we see in neuronal activity may come down to that variability in inference, which may be systematic or may be random. Okay, and then sort of another piece of this idea of internal perceptual representations is that I've contrasted it to this notion that I have this single sort of feed-forward cascade all the way to what do I do to an action. And in fact, another line of thought, sort of separate, or line of work separate from the perceptual side, has looked at the representation of the value of different actions or predictions about values of different courses of action. And those seem to be represented in their own structures, separate to the perceptual ones, and that meant different pieces of perceptual information that inform value, in many experimental situations, this is the value of, say, making a saccade to the left or the saccade to the right, or touching the left button or touching the right button or something like that. But that value calculation appears to be informed by the percept, but represented separately. So again, that sort of supports the idea that there's actually a perceptual representation and a perceptual inference stage in the brain that we can sort of try to chart out different bits of the brain that do different pieces of this process rather than it being a single kind of input to output black box. Maybe I'll talk about states and transitions later. Okay, so again, all of this is contrasted to an idea that's really, or I'm trying to raise in contrast to an idea that's gained currency in the last 5 to 10 years, which is really a sort of modern version of an idea that was called connectionism back in the 70s and 80s, which is this sort of training large networks in this very data-hungry way, usually with supervision at a level of detail that the natural world just does not provide. Sometimes, actually increasingly often, with supervision in the form of reinforcement in a somewhat more realistic setting, but still with a density of reinforcement which is not practical in biological systems. And indeed, if you sit down people to do the same tasks as the machines are trained to do, the machines will eventually be much better than the human, but the human will start off learning much more effectively. So the initial learning curve will be much faster for the human for number of episodes played of a game or something like that. Okay, and so the kind of underlying idea behind the learning side of what I'm going to talk about today is that if we can manage to take this sensory information and break it down into underlying physical variables in the world that interact in some regular causal way, right, and make inferences about those, then that process provides the substrate that we need. This ability to infer properties of the world from sensory input provides the substrate we need to do the sort of thing that we're able to do, to be flexible, to be efficient in terms of the amount of data we need to learn these structures, and to generalize well, because within that graphical structure that we'll start to describe, we may only need to change a small piece of it while keeping the rest invariant in order to move into a new domain effectively. Okay. All right, and so where we're going is to start to talk about these ideas of probabilistic unsupervised learning. And they will seek to learn some of this sort of causal structure in the world. And they will do so by exploiting a particular mathematical property that we might expect is part of the generative kind of process by which sensory input is created, which is that we often have conditional independence. That is, if I have a common cause for two observations, but the two observations don't interact themselves, then conditioned on knowing what the causal quantity was, the two observations are independent in a statistical sense. And that idea of conditional independence, which shows up a lot, is the idea of a Markov state. Maybe an idea that some of you have heard before. So if I think about time series or any kind of chain of observations, I might often, a simple Markovian chain would be one in which the state or the value at a given time depends statistically only on the preceding one, but not or equally, if we look, if it's a chain that can go in either direction, only on the two values on either side, but conditioned on them on no further ones, right? So you don't have to go further out in the chain. If I know my neighbor's values, that's all the information I have for choosing the value of a variable in between. That's a Markov chain. And in many situations, we think of the underlying, that's a reasonable description of most physical processes, is that there's some physical state of the physical system, and it evolves according to rules of motion. And those that evolution depends only on the current state, right? I don't need to know anything about the past in order to work out how things are going to evolve. As long as my state vector is elaborate enough, it has to have, in a mechanical system position, velocity and acceleration. And so these sorts of ideas, so that's a Markov chain. And often when we're trying to make sense of the sensory environment, we might assume that there is an underlying Markov process, and our observations are conditioned only on the current state. And that's something that we would call a hidden Markov model, or that goes by various names, a state space model. And that idea can be very powerful in extracting the relevant state information behind our sensory information. And again, we'll see some examples of this as we go on. All right. Another example, actually, that we'll come on to in a moment is Q combination. This is a situation where there's a single underlying property of the world, but it provides information in, say, two separate sensory modalities or two different cues within one modality. And we need to put those together. And again, we put them together under the assumption that any variability in the two cues is independent given the underlying source. So all the covariation informs us about the properties of the source. Okay, so let's start talking about a few older experiments that try to tease apart these things in a more quantitative way. Yes.
Just like to ask a question. I was wondering, how do you distinguish the representation from computation? Because in my mind, representation needs to be computed by the brain. So what would be the?
So I think it's really a distinction between two different ways of thinking about the problem. One is to just think about representation itself. The other is to think about representation as folded into computation. But you're right. Computations need representations to think about what is happening in the course of them. And the representation must be computed. So it's the output of computation. So I think it's, one way to think about let me just jump forward. So here's a picture which many of you might have seen, kind of a depiction of the visual pathway essentially as just a series of mostly feed forward, although in the picture they allow for recurrence, kind of processing stages. And the idea would be to say that, well, in each of these stages, maybe with the recurrence and so forth, a computation happens, but I can think about, say, the endpoint of that computation as a representation with an identifiable relationship to some property in the outside world. And that's sort of what we're seeking. All right, let's go back. We'll go back to here, which is sort of a simple Q combination experiment. I think not quite the first, but one of the first of the experiments that looked at how people are able quantitatively to put together two sources of information by Mark Ernst and Marty Banks back in 2002. What they asked people to do here was to judge the height of a bar that sort of a physical, well, an apparently physical bar, except that it was entirely virtual in the sense that they had their finger and thumb in a little phantom robot, it was called, that could apply counterforce according to how hard they squeezed. And so it could simulate the haptic experience of a bar being present. And they were looking at a set of dots on a screen through stereo glasses. And some of those dots were raised, and the idea was that those raised dots showed this front surface of the bar. Okay, and so observers had two sources of information: the haptic sense of the bar height and the visual appearance of kind of what the height of the region where the dots were raised was. And they were asked to compare this bar that they were experiencing to a reference bar that they actually experienced in the same way. The difference being that the reference bar was provided with no visual noise. So the dots were all at the same level in the background or at the raised surface of the bar. Whereas in the test case, they provided a certain amount of depth noise to the different dots. So it was like you had a rough surface, both for the background and for the foreground. And also in the case of the test bar, unbeknownst to the observers, the haptic information, the visual information didn't agree. Okay, so the experimenters had provided a slightly different haptic height to visual height. Okay, and so if we think about what should happen in this situation, presuming that the observers don't latch on to the idea that in this test bar there's something weird going on with disparity between these two cues, if they just assume, given that one of these cues is noisy, that they're just noisy reports of a single underlying quantity, then we might imagine that given visual information, they would have some associated, because the information is somewhat noisy, they would be perhaps process that variability and have some associated, essentially probability distribution represented in some sense or present, at least we can analyze the system externally in some way. We'll talk about representations much later on, which represents some possible range of actual heights given the visual information. Similarly for haptic. In the very simple case where we assume that these two distributions are both Gaussian distributions, they have two different means, and this picture is slightly misleading because if there's variability in the input, then the actual location of that, the center of that Gaussian belief will actually jitter from trial to trial, of course. But here it's shown at its average point, which is by design is the actual value that the experimenters provided as the visual input. This was the actual value that the experimenters provided the haptic input. If these two things are Gaussian, then when we put them together, do the maths, which is basically if they are independent, given the true, if my belief, the variability in the visual and variability in the haptic information are independent, given the true height, then my joint belief height, given two sources of information, is the product of the two beliefs. That comes from the independence. Multiply together two Gaussian functions, and I get another Gaussian function. And that Gaussian function is going to be narrower than either of these. If we measure its the associated quantity to measure its width is something that we will call the precision, which is the inverse of the square of the sigma parameter. Okay, the sigma parameter being the standard deviation if you think of the Gaussian as a distribution, right, which it is in this particular case, right? So if I take the inverse of the variance, that's a precision. The precision of the joint Gaussian is the sum of the precisions of the two separate of these two separate things. Okay, and so if the two underlying precisions are equal, then I'll get a precision that's twice as large here, and I will get a distribution that's located right in the middle of the two of them. Okay, so the mean of that joint distribution is the weighted average of the two means, weighted by the relative precisions. That means that if the visual information is more precise, has a higher precision, therefore a smaller variance, the weighted average will shift the distribution, my distribution of beliefs over to this location. Okay. Now, we can't access the belief, in this experiment at least, they didn't try to access the width of the belief of the observer directly. So they didn't know whether it was getting narrow in this way. But we can also access things in a slightly different way. We can say, let's assume for the moment that observers have the correct level of internal precision in their belief. And we can and what do we mean by correct? Well, what it means to be correct here is that it matches the actual variability they produce in their answers when we give them just one stimulus, right? So if I provide just haptic information alone, and I look at, and I ask them to judge height, let's do a simple thought experiment where they just report the height in millimeters, let's say. So one time they'll say 44, one time they'll say 45, next time 43, something like that. I can look at the variance of those, and I can ask whether or not I can make the assumption that their internal distribution about belief given any one experience, rather than being a delta function at, say, 43 millimeters, which is what they reported, takes into account some of that width, right? So it has this distributional form as they've drawn here. Now, of course, in this particular experiment, they didn't do this by asking people to report a number. Instead, they did this judgment against a reference. And so they can get the same information from the slope of the psychophysical curve, or the psychometric function here. So the slope of this is basically, which is the times that they're asked to report whether this one is taller or shorter than the reference. When they're very similar, people will give an answer that's in proportion, in some sense, to that underlying noise. And so the slope of that curve tells them what that width is. And so we can make the assumption that people's internal beliefs have the same width as would be indicated by the variability in their answers. and therefore work out how much they should shift their answers on average, and how much the variability in the answers should be, right? Which is a slightly different quantity to what's the width of the belief. We can translate that into a variability, and that's exactly what they did to make predictions about what the psychophysical curve would look like in the situation where they provide two sources of information, but with different reliabilities. Okay, and so here are the results from that experiment. So in the first figure over here, what you're looking at is the psychophysical curves when there's only one source of information available. The red line is for the haptic information, and so you can extract a reliability or a precision from that. The blue curves are for visual information with different amounts of visual noise, this kind of roughness to the dots. You can see that as they get rougher, so the triangles are the roughest, this curve gets flatter and flatter. That is, the width of the variability increases. Okay, and so if they are working optimally, then the width of their belief about that quantity should also increase. And you can now then look at the combination where you provide both visual and haptic information together, and again with varying degrees of visual noise. There's not an easy way to change the haptic noise. That's just some internal property of the person. But you can change the visual noise, and you can see that as the visual noise reduces, that is, as the visual information becomes sharper, and in particular sharper than the haptic information. Look at the blue circles and squares relative to the haptic crosses over here. You see that the curve shifts, the psychophysical curve shifts towards the visual information. And remember, they had done this experiment where there was actually a difference between the haptic and visual information. So it shifts towards the visual information, such that the point of subjective equality, point where you say 50-50, that one is higher or lower, it shifts over in that way. And again, you can take the precisions from these curves to make predictions both about the degree of shift you should have over here and about how sharp each of these psychophysical curves should be. And what you're seeing down here is the agreement between those predictions in gray and the actual measurements that come from these figures over here as the data points in magenta. And so when the noise level is low, the visual weight should be quite high, around 0.8, as inferred from the estimated shifts over here, and indeed it is around there. At 0.7, so this is clearly a nonlinear effect. At 0.7, we still expect a similar degree and see a similar degree. When the noise level goes up to whatever it is, 133%, we now expect something close to equal variability between the haptic and visual information. And again, you can sort of see that on the curves here, which are close to overlaid. There's a blue line and a dashed magenta line, have essentially the same slope in this figure. So that's the point at which the reliability of the two Qs is equal. And indeed, you see weights close to 0.5 in the real data as well as the prediction. And then as the visual information becomes noisier, the haptic should be overweighted. You can also see that the precision of the combined information also follows the prediction. So that's the gray dot over here. And it's important to note that the combined precision is always better or equal to either the visual or haptic information alone. And perhaps that's strongest in this case where the visual and haptic precisions were equal. We note that the precision obtained when you provide both pieces of information is better. This curve with both pieces of information has a sharper slope in the middle than do either of the curves that went in together. To put them together, right? So this is evidence that you really are combining these two sources of information and using the fact that they are conditionally independent to combine the information optimally. Any questions on this one? Yeah.
A question about the metric way of interrogating the width of the belief.
Mhm.
I think I may have just not caught the idea here, but what's the idea that if you have belief of a certain width, say your belief about the height is it's a Gaussian sentinel-1 and its width is 0.1, standard deviation is 0.1. It's the idea that if you ask me to guess whether the thing is longer than 0.9, I will guess randomly with the proportion of yes guesses corresponding to the area under the Gaussian to the right of 0.9.
No, and that's a very important point. So thank you for bringing it up. So there are a couple of models. So one model is that people respond randomly in that way. I think I wouldn't say it's settled, but I think I can certainly discuss some data. If it's a point of interest, maybe it'll something I'll try to add on later. I think we now have some evidence that in many of these experiments is not what's going on quite categorically. People are responding. So the variability that you see that creates that psychometric curve is some sort of internal variability of an origin that we really do not understand. People often think about it as some kind of sensory noise, just noise in the sensory epithelial activity that gets mapped through computation and amplified in some way. But what that amplification process is, we simply don't know. But what we do know is that we repeat the same physical experiment as far as we can time and time again, and your responses are variable. So the idea here is that we're taking that variability as given, but assuming that if you act optimally, you are aware, in quotes, or you process that sensory information in a way that is consistent with that variability, which means that the belief that you form at any given time will have a center that is variable because of that variability, and a width that matches that variability because you know, in quotes, about it. That makes sense? So what's sort of, that's why I said this picture is a little misleading, because they've drawn a single bump for the visual information centered at the location that the experimenters provided. What you should have in mind is that every time I do one of these trials, I'll get a bump at a slightly different location. It'll be jittered around, but it will still have the same Gaussian width, because given the sensory information and the fact that it's giving you a mean this time around of whatever, let's say that was 5 to start with, so 5.5, you know that there's a chance that that 5.5 measurement was off by a factor of, by that 0.5 value. And so you assign some probability to the possibility that the true value was, in fact, 5, the 5.5 median that you're finding right now. So that's, and optimality would have the width of the belief match the width of the variability. So that's the computation that we're running forward to ask, if that is the case, and if you then combine the two sources of information correctly according to those beliefs, you can make a prediction about what your responses should look like. And that's what we see. So maybe that'll become a little clearer again in this next experiment. This is one that Louise Whiteley and I did, again, now getting quite a while back. And so now what we're going to test is whether this sort of similarly hypothesized internal belief can be integrated with cost information effectively. So what we ask people to do here is just to judge for these two Gabor-like patches, whether the lower one was shifted left or right of the upper one. That's a very standard and simple psychophysical task. Our catch was sort of twofold. We first of all set up a asymmetric matrix of rewards. So if you were correct, you got plus 10 points, whichever answer you gave. But if you were wrong, and you were wrong and said right, the lower one was shifted right, you lost 15 points in this particular block. Whereas if you had gone for left and were wrong, you would only have lost 5 points. Okay, so there's an asymmetry in the payoffs. As a safe answer, if you want. And so you should tend to take that safe answer more often than the riskier answer. But the amount by which you should do that, make that shift, should be titrated correctly to your uncertainty, if you're acting optimally, which in turn should be correctly matched to your variability in the way we just discussed. That line of reasoning makes sense? Okay, so this is a situation that actually revisits a kind of asymmetric cost design that people had used in psychophysical experiments going back into the 50s and 60s. The second difference that we introduced was we simply didn't give people feedback trial to trial. And the idea is that if you give them feedback trial to trial, they can simply adjust some internal sense of threshold until they're getting the most points. Okay. Whereas in this situation, we just gave them a total aggregated number of points every 15 trials or so, and the blocks switched often enough that there was not enough information to do that kind of feedback-driven learning. So we were trying to tap into the internal sense of uncertainty and whether people adjusted their answers according to that, right? So the idea is the stimulus, here's the stimulus shift that generates this psi internal variable, which we'll think of as sort of having a shift axis corresponding to this offset x. So we can draw it as a corresponding distribution in the internal variable psi centered on average at x. Based on that response value, that single value, which is variable around x, we have a belief centered at that one value, which is a belief about the value of x. So this is the symmetry, and those two should have the same width in an optimal system. And then given that belief, we can take these costs and rewards, which are basically boiled down to a single parameter alpha, which is this asymmetry between them, and come up with an answer, left or right. And so, the prediction, of course, is that if the cost on the right is greater than the cost on the left, your psychometric curve should shift to the right. That is, you should answer. So this is what's being plotted here is the probability of your saying right, or the number of trials on which you say the lower one was shifted to the right. You should do so less often, right? You should take that riskier answer less often. And so that corresponds to a shift to the right of the curve. Conversely, if left is the riskier answer, you should say left. You should say right more often. And so your curve will shift the other way. That's what happens. And again, you can see that the predictions based on each individual observer's slope, right, of the psychometric curve, which is a measure of their variability, which we translate into, by hypothesis, an internal uncertainty, and then ask whether or not people actually shift in proportion to that uncertainty. Right, that's the steps of the computation, and the answer is yes, very much so. Right, so again, the predicted curves and the data points agree. So we've seen integration of two pieces of information sort of simultaneously. We've seen we've seen integration with cost information. Here's another example. Unfortunately, I can't show you the video anymore because it was a Flash video and you can't do Flash anymore. Somebody needs to remake it. I'll try to, either I or Yair Weiss, who originally came up with this particular demonstration. So the idea is that if I show you, or were to show you one of these rhombuses moving around on the screen, with the veridical motion being horizontal, so it's just shifting left or right. If it's a kind of very eccentric, I'm not sure if eccentric is the right word for a rhombus, but a very elongated rhombus that is of high contrast, then you will see it shifting left and right, just as is veridical. If I give you the same thing with much lower contrast, you will perceive it as moving in a diagonal direction instead, rather than moving actually horizontally. But if I change the aspect ratio of the rhombus, then that effect is much smaller. Okay, so what's going on? So this is an effect that had been known for a while, and people thought about it as a trade-off between two ways of estimating the motion of a complex object. So if I just do a similar thing, say with just thinking about gratings of lines, just sets of lines moving, and I want to estimate the net I assume that they belong to a single object. So there's a pattern that's moving, and I want to estimate the motion direction and speed of that pattern. Then there's two ways you could imagine doing it. You could estimate, so very crucial piece of information I haven't added in here yet. We know that your motion detection system works on local information, just sort of anatomically and physiologically. So there's a little local motion sensor in your primary visual cortex that's making an estimate about motion within a few of the visual scene within a few degrees. And if you only have a few degrees of visual space, right? And so if you only have information in that local area, and there's a contour, an edge that runs right across the visual area, then there's no way to get any information about the motion parallel to that edge locally. You can only get information about the speed of motion perpendicular to the edge, right? That's called the aperture problem or aperture effect. You're viewing motion through small apertures. And so at any one of these local sensors, you have information about, so if I plot this in this velocity plot over here, the direction that I can estimate locally depends on the orientation of the bar or the orientation of the edge. And so any direction of motion consistent with this dashed line is, or along this line, is consistent with my visual information, right? So, and I've got two different, different local regions will be reporting two different pieces of information. So one of them will be, say, this will measure this perpendicular motion. Another might measure this perpendicular motion. The direction of the arrow is determined by the orientation of the contour, because that's the only direction I can sense motion in. The length of it is determined by the speed with which that contour is moving orthogonal to the axis. And so the other direction, the parallel direction, is unspecified. And that's why any motion direction along this perpendicular line to the arrow is equally possible. Okay. And so now you can put these two together in at least two different ways. You can look for the intersection of constraints. That's what the IOC is here. That is the point that is consistent with both of those. Or you can just take a simple vector average. Okay. And what it looked like was going on here was that in this case, right, in figure B, your motion direction, which is now in this diagonal direction, indeed looks like the vector average of the judgment you might make based on the orthogonal direction to this bar and that to this bar over here. Whereas in this high contrast case, you seem to be doing the intersection of constraints and therefore getting the veridical direction of motion. So people have thought of this as sort of trading off between two different sorts of computation. What these guys did, Jari Weiss, Eero Semencholi, and Ted Adelson, is argue that in fact, what may be going on is just probabilistic inference. And what's changing is that in the lower contrast conditions, and this is an idea that we've come back, sort of has shown up a lot in thinking about perceptual inference, although again, we don't quite understand why, but under lower contrast conditions, you're less certain, okay? And so if we now sort of make this figure in two dimensions of these probability distributions, much like the ones we had in the that I drew for the Ernst & Banks case, we can think of these lines of consistent velocities as being very narrow Gaussian ridges in the high contrast case, but much broader Gaussian ridges in the low contrast case. Okay. Now, again, if we assume that your detection of motion at each one of these regions is conditionally independent given the true underlying motion direction, then your estimate of that true motion direction should be formed by multiplying together these two distributions. Okay. And in this case, we'll also introduce a prior belief, a sort of structural prior, which is, you can think of it as a sort of motion Occam's razor, if you like, amongst all directions of motion consistent with the information we get from the sensory information, which we call likelihoods here, we will favor those that are slowest. Okay, so our prior is just favoring slow motion, slow motion, without any sense of direction. If the sensory information is very precise, then that prior has very little impact. We multiply these two things together, and they're only going to have high mass at the location where they both overlap, and that's the intersection of constraints. So at high contrast, you get intersection of constraints. At low contrast, though, the region of overlap becomes much, much larger. You can think of a much larger band. Well, actually, this region shown in the lower picture here is that of the overlap. And now if we multiply that again by the prior, that will bring the peak within this region to the point that's closest to the origin, because the prior is a zero-centered Gaussian. And so now you get something that looks much more like vector averaging. So a single inferential process, probabilistic process, can explain both of these phenomena. And if now these, even at low contrast, if the two angles of orientations whose motion we can sense locally are much further apart, then again, the region of intersection becomes much smaller, much tighter, and much closer to the intersection of constraints. And so the impact of the prior is much smaller, as indeed happens in the psychophysics. So all of these different pieces can be sort of fit together into a single theory. Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If I take this picture,
yeah,
that means that I'm also more uncertain about my answer.
In the case of low contrast, yeah.
I should
yeah.
give a viable answer.
Yes. Yeah. That is absolutely right, and that is exactly what would be predicted in the situation. Because it's a little. So again, the analysis here, and this is often true for the pictures that people draw, although the maths that they do will be correct. But we're drawing a single bar here, but actually, for that to be consistent as your belief, it again needs to be variable from trial to trial, because it's only when you have variability that you should have width to your belief, right? So those two things should always go together. So to calculate the variability, we need to see how that maps through, right? So I can't just take the width of the final belief in this kind of idealized situation and think that I have variable samples from that. Or rather, I could, that would be one model, but it's a model that doesn't seem to work. Okay.
I think
how are we doing on time? Yeah.
Can we take a break?
Sure.
Right.
Sure. Yeah. No,
So let's take a. So let's take like a sort of like until 10:50 break, like a short break, so that we're not too behind, like with the thing, and then we'll come back. So there are coffees outside, and we'll come back at 10.
It's a good time to.
Yeah. Is it?
I think this is as good a time as any.
Okay. Okay. So we'll come back at 10:50. Quick one.
Okay. I can just answer your question.
So 我们的学生怎么样? How is our students? Do you have any questions? Please post it on the Zoom. Yeah.
Now, and it's a coffee break, and then we'll come back then. It's a very short break.
Yes, so there is one question about in the chat. So I guess we answer them like.
Should we just after the break? I'll take them just after the break. Sure.
Yeah, we can do that.
Sure.
Okay.
We're going to sort of going to do the question in the schedule. We ask 20 minutes question and answer, but we're because of we started late. I think we're just gonna. It's best if we just do it organically, and then lunch we're going to aim for like 11:40 for lunch. Okay.
Yeah. We can start lunch
yeah.
a bit later.
Yeah, we can start a bit later. Technically, since we started 10 minutes late, so I think that works better. All right.
Just maybe one announcement for lunch. Sorry, Maneesh. A number of you guys have indicated that you're vegetarian. So there are vegetarian and non-vegetarian meals. The vegetarian meals are in fact vegan. So it's vegan and non-vegan. So please take those only if you are vegan or vegetarian, and the non-vegetarian should take the regular ones. Okay, good.
All right, I'm going to try to speed up my bit of this a little bit to make sure we don't run over or that I don't have to stop too early. But don't let that stop you from asking questions. So let's pick up the questions that we had at the end. Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask whether the priors are symmetric for velocity usually, or
yes. So in all of this work, the assumption and it's a method they modeled other experiments other than the one I'm showing you here. They assumed a symmetric directional prior. So just spherical.
because usually for orientations there's
There's a complicated pattern for orientation. That's right. Were there any questions online? We've got a
Another question in the chat, but I think it's clarified now.
All right. Okay, so let me move on. So here's another kind of probabilistic inference that shows up. Again, a short-term learning of priors that I think is very interesting. In this case, we're looking at an experiment, very simple. It's an auditory experiment. 2 tones are played. Subject has to report whether the second one was higher or lower than the first one. In this case, they are getting feedback. They have an unlimited amount of time to respond. When you do these sorts of experiments, and this is true for a whole range of psychophysical experiments, you see a rather distinctive pattern of answers. So far we've looked at these psychometric curves, which are just collapsed over, so often they would be plotted, for example, as a function of difference, in this case of frequency, and you could look at whether the answers were, how the answers varied with difference in frequency. Here we're looking at the answers as a function of the 2 frequencies. So F1 is the first tone, F2 the second tone, and we're seeing a blue dot whenever a subject was correct for that combination, and a red dot when they were wrong. And you can see that the red dots cluster in this very distinctive way over here. That's true in the histogram as well, where you can see the proportion of times that they're correct here. So they're correct in these regions and wrong more often in these regions. And these are regions where the second tone, the first tone is higher than the average of the tones being used in the overall experiment. And so one model of what's going on in the situation, actually I'll draw it in the next figure here, is that it's a process of inference, but now inference in recovering information that's been stored in memory with additional variability, again, of a source that we don't understand, being introduced by the memory process. So assume now that we've learned the distribution, or the assumption here is that we've learned the distribution of stimuli being used in the experiment. We then, and so that forms a sort of prior expectation about the tone frequencies we'll encounter. Here's that first frequency played in. There's some noisy process, partly perhaps in the sensory process, but here we're going to think about the process of noise added by memory. That associated with that noise is an internal belief that carries with it uncertainty. This means that now at the time that the second tone is played and the decision has to be made about whether it's higher or lower, we take that uncertain noisy information from memory, combine it with the prior to get a posterior. And so if that first tone was above the average used in the overall experiment, that process of adding uncertainty and combining with the prior will tend to pull it down towards the mean. And this phenomenon is often called a contraction bias because it sort of contracts the remembered stimuli towards the mean. And again, it's seen for these auditory stimuli, it's seen for lots of other kinds of things. In fact, this particular one that these guys studied, in fact, you're going to hear from Jonathan later in the summer school, I think, this is Jonathan Lindstein, was actually a visual stimulus judging the height, the lengths of bars on the screen. Okay, So then we did an experiment where we looked, so people had talked about contraction bias for a while. The question was whether people are really sensitive to the details of these short-term distributions. So again, we're looking for evidence or trying to ask whether the system, to what extent the system is sensitive to these different forms of distribution. So we tried 4 different distributions in this series of experiments. 2 broad uniforms. You can sort of see this blue line here and this reddish line here. A Gaussian distribution in black, and then this kind of 2-part uniform distribution with 2 separated uniform bands with a gap between them in green. And what we found was that the total effect, and again, this idea had shown up in some ways before, the total effect of this bias can be broken down into 2 parts. A long-term part, which was really sensitive to the overall structure of stimuli used in a long block in the experiment, and a shorter term effect, which was basically with an exponential weighting, an effect, an influence of just the few preceding stimuli in the experiment. And that sort of makes sense. You need to learn this prior somehow. And so we're sort of seeing evidence of modifying the prior from the short term, but also an accumulated long-term effect. And if you think about the large uniform distribution, then, so I guess the first thing to note is that whatever the distribution is, the short-term effects, which are these curves over here, were pretty similar, which makes sense. The process by which you learn the distribution doesn't depend on the distribution. But the long-term effects were quite different, and indeed, again, matched to some, at least qualitatively, the pattern that you would expect people to have based on the shape or the optimal shape based on the actual distribution used in the experiment. So the optimal one is in gray, and the measured value from a curve fitting exercise based on what the observers did is in blue. And so you can see that in the case of the uniform distributions, the effect is mostly at the edges. If you're in the middle of the uniform distribution, the prior isn't biasing you either way. For the Gaussian, it's pretty much linear as ought to be for the maths. And for this kind of 2-part case, you can see that sort of illustrates the fact that it's not just contraction to the global average of stimuli used in the experiment, because when that thing is actually absent, you get pulled to the sort of local average of the band in question, rather than to the average of the whole distribution overall.
So what's the delay between the 2 tones?
In this case, 1 second.
If you increase that delay, does it increase the contraction bias?
Because
that's what you would expect if you combine.
So we know from other experiments, yes. Actually, what Ashurian and Lowenstein did was they actually inserted an additional task into that memory phase, and they showed that increased the contraction bias as well. So additional load. So the effective time is a little weaker and a little argued about, but they had a load. Yeah, exactly. But there's some orientation. Somebody asked about orientation. We've been doing some orientation versions of this more recently, and we definitely there's an effect of this variability that you can see there with time.
So the idea is that you store a noisy representation of the first tone, but then you will kind of compute the posterior later on when you need it. You don't compute the posterior initially. So otherwise you wouldn't have.
So the noise in the 2 stimuli has to be different. Otherwise you'd contract them both by the same amount and not get an overall contraction bias. So there has to be additional noise associated with memory for this theory to work.
No, I understand.
But it's not, so you couldn't compute the posterior before memory if the noise is introduced by memory, right? Unless it was somehow part of the encoding process.
No, I understand, but I think this assumes that you're computing the posterior when you need it, when you see the second tone.
Sure, or equivalently that you use the prior and the 2 sources of likelihood at a single step to make a decision. But that decision is sort of the probabilistic optimal one. So we don't have evidence that there's a separate posterior calculation step and then a comparison versus putting it all together at once. Okay, so let's come on now to sort of actually what will be a very quick survey of some ideas behind learning here. But that's fine because as we'll see, we haven't got very far with ideas about how to actually learn probabilistic models of this sort. So the fact that we'll be very quick, I think, will be fine. But I just want to sort of, what we've done so far is to survey a few psychophysical experiments that people have done over the years to provide evidence for this notion that you really are processing sensory information in a way that is sensitive to or seems to respect uncertainty well, suggesting that you build internal beliefs of some sort, or at least some carry around some sort of what a statistician would call a sufficient statistic, from which you can sort of do probabilistic calculations that are appropriate given the sort of probabilistic calculus of basically Bayes rule and Bayesian combinations. Okay, so I think that contrasts with this sort of alternative motif that we have for sensory processing, illustrated here for the visual system, of this kind of cascade of recognition or feature detection processes. And so the argument is that, while this view has been very, very successful for thinking about the process of categorization, and indeed in work, in this I took this figure from a paper by Dan Yeamans and Jim DiCarlo. I think that their work and others exemplifies the fact that there's been this wonderful correspondence that people have been able to identify between sort of putative activations at sort of middle stages of processing in artificial networks trained to do tasks, such as image categorization, and internal representations that they can measure in, for example, monkeys looking at the same images, but maybe not even doing a task with those images. And indeed, the animals may not have seen those particular images before, so may not have ever been trained to do any sort of task there. So there's a suggestion that this task-driven training can indeed learn internal representations that are somewhat similar to those that you can find in primates, and as good a picture of what those representations might be as any that we have, probably better than any other that we have. Nonetheless, they seem to be missing an essential part of the computation, which is all of this perceptual inference stuff that we've been talking about. And so the hope, if we really want to sort of make this analogy between learning systems of an artificial sort and or extract mathematical principles that we can embody in the artificial system that do match the mathematical principles that guide learning in the real biological systems, that we can achieve at least similar success, perhaps expect greater success, by instead of using these task-trained feed-forward networks, using networks that actually reflect this idea of inference and breaking up and parsing of the sensory environment into its different constituents. And the toolkit that we have in machine learning to do that sort of thing is that of building what people will often call probabilistic generative models. PGM is an abbreviation that you'll see used. These are models in which the nodes of a graph, so they're graphical models and graphs in the kind of graph theory nodes and edges sense. The nodes of the graphs represent variables, and we think of those variables as variables that are descriptive of the state of the world and whose values are being inferred as part of the inferential process, right? And the connections between, so the edges between those nodes reflect basically dependence between those different variables. So if an object is present at a particular location with particular illumination, then there will be some part of that object that will be visible. And therefore, there'll be some node here reflecting parts or perhaps surfaces, and then more local features, which are dependent on that structure. And there may be interactions between different object parts. So given an object is present, if this edge is here, then that edge will be over there or something like that. Right? So there are interactions at all kinds of layers between these nodes. But the structure of the world is encoded in what are the nodes and what are the dependencies between them. Okay, and so then this kind of structure allows us both to encode the prior information that we've seen people use, because these can be prior distributions over different nodes in this graph. The conditional independence structures that seem to be important for both inference or used for inference and are crucial for actually learning the structure of these sorts of systems. And also allow us to, once we've encoded all of that information in such a model, we're able to do inference. That is, in principle at least, we're able to work out, given sensory information, say a retinal image in the visual case, what objects might be present, and that information will flow, again, in a sort of hierarchical way, but the information, that inferential process is actually a two-way process. So if I have partial information about an edge, but information from other edges tells me about what object might be present, then that allows me to fill in and work out what that obscured edge might have been. Okay, because these models are basically using, or it's not maybe not immediately obvious, but mathematically it turns out that the fact that these models are using or looking for this conditional independence structure in the world means that perhaps with a few nudges of sort of structural based priors, they're actually able to learn the underlying dependence and structure here just from experience of the sensory environment alone. They don't need labels for what objects are present in a scene, again, at least in principle. And maybe I won't go into this direct and undirected point at the bottom. Okay, so that's all true in principle. The state of affairs, though, is that actually making that work at any sort of scale is incredibly hard. And so what I'm going to do is review some of the work that's been done in a neuroscience context very, very quickly over the last, I suppose, couple of decades, pretty much until maybe around 2010, 2012-ish, whereupon a lot stopped because this kind of feed-forward task-driven training took over, which has been much, much more successful and is in some sense much easier to do. But what we might hope is that we're sort of at an inflection point. So this, by the way, is the perceptron. The perceptron, it was actually a physical object that was built. So the wires, your connections are actually wires sitting over here, and synaptic weights are actually potentiometers sitting over here. And this particular object was built back in the 60s, maybe late 50s even. And you can see that there was a lot of hype even back then. Apparently it was going to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of existence. Maybe. But what we might hope, it took a long while to get to the point of doing any of those things if we've actually managed any of them. Maybe we've got C at this point for certain definitions of C. But it took quite a while but the basic principle, in some sense, that drives a deep network that's doing object recognition isn't that different to the one that's driving was driving the perceptron back then. And so one of the hopes I think we have is that the principles that we need for the sort of probabilistic learning that seems a better match to biological systems are things that we maybe already have, but we need to work out how to make them scale. And so I'll say a little bit about that, hopefully, in the last 5 or so minutes. Okay. I don't think I really need to reiterate any of this. We've seen it. Okay. All right. Any questions? Yeah.
So we say that that probabilistic models for, say, something like Bayesian inference is literally literally there are neurons in the brain that are sort of doing that computation with the weights representing these conditional probabilities between them, or would Bayesian inference more so be just like a byproduct of a higher level sort of abstract computation between neurons?
So I guess my own take on this is that it's much more reasonable to imagine that the system learns to represent beliefs and the right rules for combining beliefs than it is to imagine that it represents single point estimates of quantities and manipulates those. Because without supervision, I don't see what signal there is to guide point estimates of single quantities, right? If you just have to build this up from sensory information alone, and all of the structures that are inferred from it are invariably inferred, you never have additional information about them, then the only coherent way to do that is a way that where those representations are representations of beliefs. Now, what they are, whether they're a simple mapping from those to the mathematical belief that we can pin down, that's a big open question. And that I'm going to talk about in the second lecture, is sort of theories that people have for what that mapping might look like. But the idea that we have point estimates of quantities in the brain strikes me as a very odd hypothesis, because I don't see where what learning signals we would have to arrive at those point estimates.
So the brain somehow, like on the fly, would have a way of computing like priors and sort of posterior sort of probabilities. Well,
the brain just has neural activity that is effective, right? The question is, if I take a system and it learns to be effective, what will those interior variables represent? So I don't think I have it in here, but one of the exercises we've done is actually ask that question in the end-to-end training sense. So you can say, take a problem that is a problem that requires probabilistic computation, train a system to solve it just with end-to-end, here's the right answer each time, and then go in to look what the representations in the interior representations look like. Indeed, they have representational information, and you can show that reliably. And again, something I can talk about in a break or add some slides at some point. That would be interesting.
Thank you.
Good question. So in that model, inference itself never gets represented because it's always dynamic. So even though the inference is always dynamically changing, and there's never an end point. I mean, there's never a representation of the inference.
So, sorry, when you say of the inference, do you mean of the computation that achieves inference?
Yeah.
Well, that is in the in a sense, that is in the connections. So we're going to, I guess I didn't emphasize this, but it will come up a couple of times. The sum of these models, and in a way, the ones that people have focused on to a greater degree are what people think of as directed models. So these edges actually are directed edges. They have arrows on them. And we can then think of a generative model, which in this hierarchy will go from the top down. So, objects and illumination and pose determine parts, and surfaces determine edges in turn. And then we have what we often call the recognition model, or the inferential model, which takes the image and makes estimates of these quantities. Right. And so in that sense, the inferential process would be embedded in the recognition network. And this, and there are sort of in the mathematical framework and in machine learning, we sort of do it both ways. So one way is we only have the generative model and then flexibly make inferences based on sensory information and the generative model alone. And the other case is we train a recognition network. And that second approach is often called amortized inference, because we kind of take many examples, do the inferential steps necessary, but then essentially embed that information in some sense into this recognition network. So we're sort of amortizing, in a vague sense, the work that we've done to spread it out over many examples. Okay, so as I said, very difficult in practice to do this, and in particular, very difficult to do with realistic models that involve nonlinear combinations of signals and things like that. And so the early work along these lines really used a very unrealistic model of anything in the sensory world. And that was one in which the sort of generative picture, which is drawn on the bottom here, is that there are some latent causal elements, which we're going to be completely agnostic about their their mapping to the world, we just say they exist in some sense. We're going to assume that they are active marginally independently. That is, knowing that one is active or has some value provides no information whatsoever about the activity of any of the others. Okay, so that's what we mean by marginally independent. And the way they create, in this case, images, is by each one's activity being a weight that multiplies a basis pattern, and then we just add them all together. It's a linear image code because of this linear additivity when we put it together. So we have basis functions. Imagine, whoops, we'll go to the picture. So the basis functions, when learned, will turn out to look like this. So you can think of the generative model as being pick a random number associated with each one of these patterns. That's the latent cause activity. Multiply the pattern by that number and add them all together. And that's your model of image generation. Okay, obviously not a very good one. Nonetheless, somewhat intriguingly, when we actually go to learn models like this, so this particular, you can do this with subtly different cost functions. This one was, there were basically 3 papers about the same time in the mid-90s that kind of took 3 different approaches here towards this. This is one by Bruno Olshausen and David Field. They applied a cost function, which is minimizing the squared discrepancy between the image values at location X, Y, and the reconstruction, which is these basis values A times basis functions, and the basis functions again are a function of location X and Y, right? So because they're a pattern on the image in the image space, and we're summing over the different basis functions. That's the sum over I. So this is our reconstruction of the image. This is the actual image we're given. We take the squared sum of squares discrepancy between them. We think of that as a sort of, you can think of that as a sort of Gaussian noise model, right? The log probability of a Gaussian will be quadratic. And then we're going to choose a, what you can think of as a prior on this basis parameter, or alternatively, you can just think of it as a sparsity penalty, because we're going to pick a prior which is sparser than Gaussian, so it has a higher kurtosis, it's sharper in the middle and has heavier tails for the same variance. And the particular one they chose is this one. Sorry.
Is there a minus sign missing in that equation?
Is there a minus sign missing? We're going to minimize squared error, and that depends on how I wrote this one. If that goes up.
The log of probability be negative number, and that's that mean is taken over something which is positive.
Yes, you're right. So this is indeed this is the yes. So the log probability will be minus this square quantity. Exactly. Okay. Okay, and so you do this. You take a set of images. Doesn't actually matter what images they are, as long as they're natural images. I think they basically use holiday snapshots. And what you find are basis functions over here that look like these little local patches with orientation information and this sort of stripiness. And these are Gabor wave, or they're close to being Gabor wavelets. We'll look at agreement shortly. That is the product of a 2-dimensional sine wave and with a Gaussian window. Okay. What's remarkable about that is that is the response field that we see in primary visual cortical neurons. In particular, so there are classes of neurons called simple cells that are, in fact, whose responses are to first approximation roughly linear in the image property, in the image intensities or pixel values. And so if we build up the sort of linear filter that corresponds to that linear response, which is almost always a Gabor function like this. If you do this with, so there are other cells called complex cells, which are nonlinear, but they have component elements to them. Again, we'll come back to that. And the components also look Gabor-like. You can do similar things by, instead of sort of this optimizing a probability in this way, you can try to maximize the mutual. Yes, Ruben.
Yeah, what is the conditional independence enforced in this model? Is it the prior?
No, so there's two kinds of independence here. There is marginal independence in the causes. So our model is saying that they are independent. So the fact that one cause is more active in this image tells me nothing about what the other causes values will be for the same image. So that's what we mean by marginal independence. Conditional independence is of pixels given causes. And that's the fact that this is a sum pixel by pixel, as opposed to having some covariance matrix that would be, so if I had a Gaussian covariance matrix that said, if the discrepancy here was large at this location, then it might also be large next door, right? That would be correlation in noise between pixels. So that would be conditional dependence. The fact that that's not in my cost function is conditional independence.
But then referring to the causes, the A's are
no. So the conditional independence here is conditional independence between pixels given causes. So once I know the cause, so they're not marginally independent because as I average over many images, if the causes are changing, the causes influence nearby pixels. So if I take one pixel in one image, then I have a pretty good guess of what the neighboring pixel is in the same image. So that's marginal dependence. But all of that information under the model comes from the cause. So if I tell you the causes and the pixel values, I take the cause values for this particular image, and now I tell you one pixel value. Now that model says that neighboring pixels are independent. I have no more information about a neighbor given the cause values. So that's the conditional independence part.
Right. I guess what I'm asking is,
where is
model you assume that you want that the actions, the A's are independent.
Yeah. Marginal.
Enforce that in this model.
So where is the marginal independence enforced? That's the fact that this is a sum over I. So a sum of log probabilities means that the probability of the whole vector is a product of each of the individual probabilities, and a product of probabilities and then multiplying probabilities and independence are basically, so the statistical statement of independence maps one-to-one to the fact that the joint probability is a product of the singleton probabilities. So those two things we just trade off.
But when you compute these A's from the images, they may not be independent, right? So
the condition, yes. So the posterior on A, given the image, is not independent.
No, I mean across all the images.
So across all the images, the model is that we're modeling them as though they are independent. You're absolutely right that if I now measure them in practice across a bunch of images, I will find that they're not, and that's model mismatch.
But there's an additional question in the chat. So, what a prior P of A
Yeah, so sorry, I should have sketched this, but the prior chosen, so this is the so basically it's this so P would be proportional to 1 plus sorry, again there's a minus sign missing. It would actually be proportional to 1 over 1 plus A squared, which is basically a very heavy-tailed distribution. So essentially it's a prior that specify that is given a certain variance is favoring sparsity. That is that this particular source for that variance will for some images, for most images in fact, be quite small in value, but for a few images it will have a very large value. So it's that kind of sparsity. Do you get them all from the?
No, that's
good. All right. Okay, so again, multiple ways to get a similar thing. You can do what we just discussed for Alt-Tasman field. You can maximize the mutual information. I'm going to go very quickly through these just to give you a sense for what people have tried to do in this space, because we don't have time to go through them in enormous detail. The first two that I showed you both used the same number of causes as there were pixels for sort of mathematical reasons. It is possible to have more causal elements in one of these models, then you have pixels, called an overcomplete model. And that again comes from the sparsity prior is what allows that. The maths gets a little harder, but it turns out that when you actually do that, you get response patterns which are by some measures somewhat closer in their properties to those that you see in V1. So I gave you a very qualitative picture of agreement to begin with. People have worked on thinking about how close these things can be made to agree quantitatively. I'll show you an example again in a slide or two. But this is one thing that helps, is going over complete. You can build hierarchical models that put together some of these components into single higher level elements that need to be coactive. So now you're starting to break independence assumption based on a hierarchy. So you have independence at the top level of the hierarchy so that the lower level no longer need be entirely independent. And that allows you to learn sort of pictures of sort of topography across you now have a defined space between causes, because that's what the hierarchy is doing, in the same way that the causes themselves define space in the visual image. In that space between causes, you get this topographic arrangement that is very reminiscent of the structure that we see in V1. Another idea is to look not at single images, as we looked at so far, but at videos, moving images, and build models now with this idea of Markov state that I mentioned briefly earlier on. So now, rather than the causal activations being chosen randomly for each frame of the video, we're going to assume that they're chosen in a way that depends on their values in the preceding frame of the video. So there's this Markov state that runs through. Again, that cue, when we work with natural video, seems to be one that drives patterns of activity that are even closer to those that we see in the visual cortex. So this particular figure came from work by Pietro Berkesh, Rich Turner and me. And so what we looked at was a model in which there were the sparsity that I just described from the Alt-Saturn field model was actually enforced in a slightly different way. There were binary variables that we think of as identity variables, which they're binary, so they're off or on. But when they're on, there's then an appearance variable or an attribute variable that will evolve according to a Gaussian distribution. So a Gaussian is sort of the midpoint of not being sparse at all. It's kind of the canonical distribution. We define the kurtosis to be 0. But when you gate that by the binary variable, then of course we get a sparse distribution, because when the binary variable is off, all of our values become 0. So this is sometimes called a spike and slab model. Spike because when you've got the 0, you've got this big spike of values all at 0. When your binary value is 1, you get this Gaussian shaped slab beneath the spike. But this was the dynamic spike and slab model. So these things needed to evolve. Both the binary variables and the Gaussians were Markov chains that evolved in time. And each binary variable was attached to a few different Gaussian variables. And so what each row of this figure is showing is the set of Gaussian variables associated with one binary variable. And so what you can see is not only do we get these sort of Gabor patterns in similar way to what you've seen before, but they have an interesting arrangement for each of these binary variables, so that when something turns on, you get an arrangement of similar orientations and slightly varying phases and locations. And we don't really have time, so I'll skip over various slides that basically argue that the properties of these detailed response receptive fields that we learn with models like this actually echo many other aspects of both single cell response properties and the topography of responses in V1. Okay, and if you scramble the videos so that you're try to fit the same model but lose the real dynamical state, then you get a somewhat different looking picture. And maybe I will come back to one point, which is this one I made about complex cells. Complex cells often have subfields that are Gabor-like, that then are combined nonlinearly, and people have estimated the dimensionality of that kind of subfield space, and the dominant answer is often around 3 to 4, something like this. In scrambled images, what we get is, scrambled movies, if we fit the same model, we get things that look much, much higher dimensional, that something that doesn't match what you might expect in visual cortex. Just skip. All right, I'm going to, we'll share the slides. Other ways to think about some of these things. There are energy models. I'll come on to that maybe in a slide or two. Another sort of dynamically couched view of this is the idea of using these state variables to try to predict and therefore cancel predictions from your representation of incoming images. That's an idea called predictive coding, which sort of fits into this similar framework. Again, the third of the papers back in the 90s, besides the two I showed you, Polsat and Field, Bell and Sunyovsky was the Infomax idea, and Rao and Ballard was the third of these that used the idea of predictive coding and found very similar representations with a slightly different cost function. One of the correlations that you find when you do this linear level model and then look at the activations of response of these sort of causal estimates, causal elements, your estimates of the causal elements. Indeed, as Ruben suggested, they're not independent. One of the forms of non-independence that you see is this sort of covariation in amplitude. So this is a conditional histogram of one of these given the other. And you can see that given the one along this axis, you can't predict the sign of the other one. These are broadly not very well. They're broadly symmetric up and down. But you can say that if this one's large, and either positive or negative, so it has large magnitude, the other one is likely to have large magnitude. So there's a co-modulation of the magnitudes, but not the signs. And this has been linked in a series of papers by people like Adelia Schwartz and Eero Semencheli and Martin Wainwright to thinking about another phenomenon that's seen in early visual cortex, which is divisive normalization, the fact that the overall strength of signal in a scene, which appears to be correlated, as you can see here, essentially gets divided out as though the response properties are actually trying to estimate an underlying variable, again, removing this common scale factor. And the generative model that corresponds to this is called, can be phrased as a Gaussian scale mixture. That is, the underlying variables are now actually Gaussian. You don't need to add any extra sparsity. The sparsity comes from this common scale factor, much like the identity variable that I described in the previous model. That one had a binary scale factor. These models have an analog scale factor. All right, out of time. Let me jump to, okay, so where are we now? I'll sum up basically. So all of those are sort of quite simple models, right? We've linear models, slight improvements with these scale mixtures. There's a more structured version of the scale mixture. I jumped this covariance coding from Karklin and Lewicki. But that was kind of where we were around, 12 years ago now, so 2010-ish. And then I think the field, to some degree, ended up getting stuck. Right? There wasn't a lot more we could do. And it seemed, I think that's because trying to build complex nonlinear models that actually echo the generative process in the world was mathematically extremely difficult. So I think in the last little while, we've started to see some chinks in that particular kind of wall, and some ways that we can try to address building more complex models, which allow us to build much deeper hierarchical generative models and corresponding inferential schemes. So one of them actually depends on an idea that goes back very far, but I think it's becoming richer in its power. That's the Helmholtz machine. I'll talk a little bit about that in a different context in the second lecture. But a couple of other ideas that come from machine learning are ideas of what are called variational autoencoders or generative adversarial networks. I won't talk about those at all, but I will give you just, if I've got a moment, I'll flash a couple of slides talking about contrastive learning and some other ways of building loss functions that might be quite powerful. So again, just one slide each to sort of flash these up and kind of set out a little bit of current thinking in this space. So the idea, I mentioned predictive coding very briefly. The idea in predictive coding in the Rao and Ballard kind of framework was to actually predict the image, or in a hierarchy, each layer would predict the layer below, and then, but that chain would go all the way down to the image itself. The idea behind contrastive predictive coding is to place the prediction quality at a higher level. So we're going to have a Markov state, if you like. It will propagate through some neural network. So it's a recurrent neural network. That's what the RNN stands for up here. We've got some complicated neural network that produces an input to that recurrent neural network. And the job of this whole system is basically to use the past to make a prediction of what this neural network is going to produce in the future. Okay? So that's intuitively the learning rule. Now, the problem with this sort of learn some internal variable, and the reason that this idea, while it sounds extremely simple, didn't really get played out effectively for a while, is that there's a trivial way to solve that problem, to make that prediction perfect, which is to make the output of this network a constant. And then, of course, you can always predict it. And so simply having a rule that says make that prediction agree won't do. So the contrastive part of this was to come up with a cost function, which essentially said, predict the value well when I take the next frame or the future frame of an actual movie, but predict badly if I take a scrambled frame. So that's the contrast. Okay. And so now, of course, the constant solution doesn't work, because that works just as well whether I scramble or don't. Okay, so that's the framework. We can talk about the maths of the cost function in detail. The particular flavor that is called now contrastive predictive coding. The underlying cost function is sometimes, or was called INFO-NCE, Informational Noise Contrastive Estimation. This paper by Ord et al., which introduced it, has recently been applied to images and compared to activation of sort of bulk activation measured in mouse, different areas of mouse visual cortex in this paper from last year. Actually, maybe I don't have time to go into this in detail. And so they built a slightly more complex model with two channels and found interesting agreements with some part of the split into two different areas, but quantitatively still kind of just partial agreement, at least with the whole hierarchy that you find in the visual cortex. So let me just finish with a little bit, so the other approach, which is to actually try to take in a generative model as we've seen so far, and reparameterize it so that we can learn a recognition model, the kind of converse to that, directly, without having to learn the generative model at the same time. So essentially make a transition so that the observations, we learn the network, or we learn a predictor that goes from observation to latent variable directly. So one model in which one might try to do this is it's a model that those of you who've encountered any machine learning will know as LDA, or latent Dirichlet allocation. LDA actually has two meanings in machine learning for some reason. This one is the latent Dirichlet allocation one. What does that mean? It means that we're going to think about an image, in this case, as a set of little patches. Think of them as little textural patches. And the way that we choose a patch is driven by a distribution over patch values, which is we're going to choose a variable that is a texture. And so one texture might produce very similar looking patches, say all 4 of these up here, which will all look very similar. In a particular image, the variable Z here says which texture we get to use. So we have a total of K textures. For a given patch, we choose a particular texture to generate it. And that, that variable, which says which texture, is the Z for that patch. Z itself is chosen from another distribution, which is image specific. And so each image has a different distribution over possible patches. And that is a Dirichlet distribution, but that's drawn from a Dirichlet distribution given some prior parameter alpha. Okay, so to generate an image in this view, I don't do this linear addition thing. I just generate patch by patch, and I'm going to say nothing about how I blend the patches together. Just going to ignore that bit question. But the way I generate the patches is I first generate a distribution over patch types for my image. Then, given that distribution, I draw the particular patch type for each patch, and I generate the patch. Okay, and that builds up an image for me. I can learn such a model without ever actually learning that generative process for patches. I just learn the recognition scheme. And again, something for us to decide to either talk about in the next lecture or to talk about offline is how that works. But now I can take a whole set of images and learn to do the recognition. And what we find is, indeed, that we learn to group together patches sort of associated with the same texture label, patches that are of a similar textural type. So what we're looking at is the patches in the real image set, which generated the highest posterior probability of being of type k equals 0, or k equals 1, or k equals 2, etc. Okay, so we're sort of picking out the most sort of this particular label-like amongst all of the patches. And you can see that there's some amount of grouping of similarity between these that again is happening automatically, but it's happening in the recognition system. All right, let me end this part. Okay, so what I've tried to argue is that we think of perception as something that has evolved as a kind of a midway point to valuing and controlling actions. Okay, and so that involves estimating these causal elements, inferring these causal elements of the world to do that well. And you can think of this as a principled guess, right? But I think the question is, how do I learn to control? How do I learn a perceptual representation that allows me to control action well, without actually getting feedback about whether my actions are good or not, or without getting enough feedback about whether my actions are good or not? And that the guess is that what allows us to do that is to find representations that actually create this sort of conditional independence. And one way of thinking about having conditional independence, so independence of observations given the variable, is that the variable has captured all the mutual information between them. So we're sort of trying to capture things or extract things that have the shared information between the different inputs. We went through a series of behavioral experiments suggesting that behavior, in fact, represents or respects the uncertainties that match the variability that we see. Made that point before. And so all of this, I think, argues for the idea that the underlying inferential processes and learning processes can probably be best understood in terms of these sorts of probabilistic generative models that we're trying to look at. And so I then very quickly talked about where we were currently in thinking about learning in such models, which is that we rather early on, sort of in the mid-90s, had success mapping probabilistic models to very early stages of processing. I showed you in vision, but similar work was also done, in, for example, in hearing. But we didn't have any sensible way to scale. And I think that we may now be at a cusp of the field where we're starting to build up these methods that will allow us to use many of the scaling approaches that have been powerful for supervised learning and reinforcement learning and bring them into the unsupervised learning setting, which may, and to the inferential sort of probabilistic setting more effectively. All right, that's my first lecture. Any questions now? Do we have time?
Yeah, I think we can have the informal questions during lunch.
Yeah.
Maybe.
From here, okay.
Yeah. So I think we are going to lunch less dinner in Beijing, and it's because we have to come back at 1 here, and so I think lunch, obviously, because we're having lunch together, is also the time for if anybody wants to ask questions offline, it's the time to do so. So lunch is just outside, and there are places outside. You guys feel free to outside, meaning outside the space, right?